Hi, I'm quilLogic, and welcome to our very first Raburn Series Premiere League Game of the Week. I'm really excited for this series because we got a great community in this league, and I'm sure we're going to have a lot of great games too. So I'll talk more about the league itself at the end of the video, so stick around for that. For now, I just want to go over how this series is going to work. Basically, each team plays one match per week. At the end of the week, I asked in the Discord what everyone's favorite game was, and they chose the game for me to cover here. This week, the game that was selected was my game. This match was between Sauron32 with white against myself with black. Sauron32 is representing the UIUC team. I'm representing HLP, which is for Husky Lime Pie. We're both board ones for our team. The way it works is each team has 8 boards, so board 1 is the strongest players all the way down to board 8. The time control for these games is always 15 minutes with a 10-second increment played online. I also want to remind everyone, make sure you subscribe to this channel, please. I'd appreciate it. Also, go check out Illini Chess. That is the Twitch channel for the UIUC chess team. I stream there sometimes, Sauron streams over there sometimes, and they've had other people too covering all sorts of different stuff, including these very Raburn games. Kicking off the game, I of course go with my trusty hippopotamus opening, where white is able to start developing pretty comfortably. Black is keeping all the pieces right near home, and it does seem pretty scary for black. White has built up an imposing center. Black has very little space, but that's par for the course in this opening. He castles, and I immediately launch an attack with g5 that he freezes in its place with the move h3. Now that I can't push this pawn forwards anymore, I decide, okay, let's just get castled, so I castle. Then he changes course. His idea, he's going to fight fire with fire, because after h4, suddenly he's the one going for a kingside attack. Both of our kings are very weak. We've both pushed the pawns in front of our own king, and not something you normally want to do. So that's why this position is going to get quite hectic quite quickly. He has a lot of pressure built up on the g5 pawn, so I push it forwards, kicking away the knight. Knight goes back. Now both my h6 and g4 pawns are under attack, but there is a way to solve both problems. I can push forwards with h5. This is where he makes his mistake. He plays the move bishop h6, which is not really the right plan. And after my next move, knight g6, he does find the right plan, which is to play knight e2, planning to rotate the knight right over to the king's side. However, he should have just immediately gone with knight e2, because the move bishop h6 doesn't actually turn out to be the most useful move. It was really important to just bring the knight to g3 as fast as possible, immediately put pressure on the h5 pawn. Another reason that bishop h6 was kind of incorrect was that in a lot of lines, the bishop actually would rather go to the g5 square, and we're going to see some examples of that in the game. So after bishop h6, now I play knight g6. I'm trying to kind of do the same thing I just showed you. He's trying to bring his knight to g3 to attack my h5 pawn. Well, I'll put my knight on g6 to attack the h4 pawn. It looks like I'm faster, but here's the question. Can I afford to take the pawn on h4? And if not, what should I do instead? Okay, well, the first move to eliminate is that queen takes h4 actually ends up just getting the queen straight up trapped after bishop g5. Queen's got nowhere to go, so can't make that move. Instead, we could try knight takes h4, and it doesn't look like there's an immediate refutation to this move, but the problem is that white will play knight g3, attacking this h5 pawn, and there's still no good way to defend this pawn, and the problem is that white's attack is coming with a lot more power than ours, because when they win the h5 pawn, once they get rid of that pawn, then this pawn's going to fall. The queen and bishop are ready to start making an attack. Meanwhile, the only piece that I have ready to attack would be this knight on h4. It doesn't have anything else supporting it, though. That would not make for a strong attack. Instead of that, there's a common principle that you should meet an attack on the flank with counterplay in the center. That inspired my next move, c5, immediately going for central counterplay. It doesn't look like it'll be enough, but it turns out to keep me in the game, because after knight g3, going for this h5 pawn, again, you need to find the right move for black here. What would you do? So again, we can eliminate queen takes h4, because that runs into the same exact problem, bishop g5. We can also eliminate knight f6. That's really the only way to attempt to keep the h5 pawn alive, but it doesn't work because, once again, bishop g5. You can see, just because every single line has bishop g5 in it, it seems like over and over, we keep seeing white playing bishop g5, and that kind of hints to why white's move bishop h6 was a serious inaccuracy, because that bishop wanted to go to g5 in so many positions. Here, the problem for black is that bishop g5 creates a deadly pin, and white is just going to be able to take the pawn on h5 next. If you try to move your queen out of the pin, well, that doesn't make a big difference, because white can eliminate the defender of the pawn and then take it next turn anyway. And again, we can see that white's queen is ready to come into the attack. The other knight's ready to come in. Black is in danger of getting mated very quickly if this happens. So we have to be really careful about how we handle this position. And it turns out the best choice is bishop takes d4. A really good move. The point is that we're sacrificing this rook. We had to give up something. There was no way we were holding on to everything here. And the point is revealed after white goes ahead and takes the rook. Now we've eliminated that dark squared bishop that was giving us a lot of problems in all of those positions, right? And immediately we can start to see some of the benefits of this because white only has one move to stay in the game. Do you think you can find the one move for white to stay alive? It turns out they had to play knight e2, but that is a really hard move to play because you're going backwards. You just spent all this time, your whole plan has been to bring that knight over to the king side, go take the pawn on h5, and now all of a sudden you're going backwards. You're admitting that something went wrong for you. And after bishop g7, the point is that the knight made space for the pawn to come up to g3. So now at least white has solidified their king side, but black has a bishop and a pawn for a rook. So we're down material, but there's huge compensation here for black because the bishop is so strong. It's unopposed on this long diagonal. We also have really strong control of those central squares. Instead of that, we can see why it was so important to kick this bishop away because of after knight takes h5, finally we can play queen takes h4. This whole time, we've been worried about getting the queen trapped. Well, now there's no bishop there to trap our queen. So the problem for white is this knight is basically trapped because after knight g3, what can you do? You can just take it. Queen takes g3. They can't take it because the bishop is pinning that pawn. Instead, he plays bishop e2. Now I grab the knight. He takes the pawn. We make a couple more moves where we're going to end up starting to trade some things. We trade off the queens. Then I trade off here, and we can start to evaluate this endgame. I played knight g6, trying to bring the knight into the game, but the point is here, the material is 2 bishops for a rook. That might not sound like a big advantage, but the 2 bishops are totally going to outperform the rook because of how well they can work together. And you can see, the bishop on c8 might not be impressive right now, but the bishop on d4 certainly is. White tries to bring the rook to d1, but with the bishop anchored there, not doing anything. We're going to start maneuvering. It's an endgame, so let's bring in the king, so the king comes over to the center to help out. Now the knight goes into the game. I make some space for the bishop to activate, grab a pawn. White tries to open up some lines for the rook, so I shut it down. We start to trade. Now I'm going to go collect another pawn on a4. Over the next few moves, you're going to see that white was able to trade the rook for the 2 minor pieces, but because I'm up 2 pawns in this rook endgame, it's not that big of a deal. And I should remind you all that we're pretty late into the game at this point, so as you can expect, I'm in time pressure. There is a 10-second increment after every move, though, so I'm not in danger of flagging. My opponent, though, still has a lot of time left on his clock. So he is ahead on time, but we're ahead on position because we've got 2 extra pawns over here on the queen side now. Even if I have to give up one of them, it'll be worth it to bring in the rook. So I play a4. The pawn's not going to survive necessarily for very long, but the idea is we're going to find a way to bring the rook into the game. So I tried rook g2. But the king is stopping us. So how are we going to bring this rook into the game? The maneuver starts with rook h2. After takes, it's really important to take a timeout from your own plan and ask yourself, what is white trying to do? White wants to play rook a7 check. And if white can get this kind of activity, they'll have big chances to save this game. So after king b7, an important move to shut out the rook there. White is now totally stuck on the defensive. Nothing they can really do, which allows me to complete my maneuver with rook h4, pressuring the c4 pawn, so it's defended by the rook. Now the rook comes to d4, centralizing the rook. After king e3, it might still be a little difficult to see how to make progress from here. So what would you do? Well, we've activated our rook. The other piece we need to activate still is our king. It's hard to find a way for the king immediately because king a6 it just gets checked away by rook a1. The king can't come forward, but we can play b5. We're going to take on c4, so if they take us, now the king comes up to b6. We're trying to bring the king to go take this pawn. If they defend it, and then I checked, I took this pawn. That was the other idea of b5, was that it brought the pawn away so that we could take this one. Now we've got 4 pawns versus 3, but we've been able to activate our king. There's no way they can trade rooks when you're down pawns in a king and pawn endgame. That's just going to be a totally winning advantage. Rook d1 trying to get active, but again, we just play king c7. We stop the rook from coming in. White finally brings the rook in, but at this point, it's too much. Rook and 4 pawns versus rook and 2 pawns is totally winning. I mean, rook and 4 versus rook and 1. And at this point, it's just a conversion. You can see giving a few checks here and there, just going back and forth because there's a 10-second increment. So just building up a little bit of extra time. But I'm going to start to make a path forward. Now it's turned into 4 pawns versus 0. and these pawns are just going to march forward. I have a total wall of pawns here, so we finally decided to resign this game. As promised, a little more info about the league. First of all, especially if you're in our league already, make sure you join our league Discord. Links for everything will be in the description. In our Discord, in the Game of the Week channel, you'll be able to make suggestions for which game I'm going to cover next. So make sure join the channel, join the discussion there. As far as the league itself, so this is the Raburn Series Premiere League. Unfortunately, we do not allow players to join our league part of the way through the season. However, the next season will still be a while, but stay tuned with me here on this channel or join our chess.com club to see when we announce the start of the next season. It's a really great league, a lot of great people in the community, so I really hope that you'll try and join our next season. Anyone can play. Currently, we have 9 teams of around 8 to 12 players each, so we have about 100 players in total in the league. We have all sorts of skill levels in the league. All the way up to board 1, we have a number of titled players. All the way down to board 8, we have players who are 400. And the great thing about this game of the week is we could have anybody's game featured, so we might have a 400 in here next week. Who knows?